Welcome back. I'm here today with Jonathan Coslet. He's the Chief Investment Officer of Texas Pacific Group, TPG Capital. Jonathan, welcome to today's show.
Thank you for having me.
So, Jonathan, before you got into private equity, what led you up to the position that you're in today?
Well, my career is actually relatively directed because I started after Wharton undergrad. I went to work at Drexel Burnham Lambert in their Los Angeles, Beverly Hills office. That was where Mike Milken and all the things were going on at Drexel in the late 80s. And we did leveraged acquisitions and leveraged buyouts. I then went back to business school at Harvard. And coming out of business school, I knew that I wanted to be an investor and wanted to use those skills that I had from my first couple years at Drexel. So a lot of the folks from Drexel at that point had ceased to exist, and they all went to a firm called DLJ, Donaldson, Lufkin, and Jenrette. So I went to DLJ with some of my old colleagues from Drexel, was there for about a year, and then I actually read in the Wall Street Journal in sort of the Who's News section that my partners, David Bonderman and Jim Coulter, were leaving the Bass family to start their own firm. And I cold called them and said, hey, I see you're starting your own firm, and I've got some experience, and I'll carry your bags. And they said, great, that sounds good to us. Can you go to CompUSA and get our first computer? And that was in late 1992, early 1993. A gentleman named Bill Price joined. He was from GE Capital, and the four of us started, and off we went.
And so today, Texas Pacific Group is in one of the top 5 private equity firms in the world.
We call ourselves TPG now. We kind of shorten it from Texas Pacific Group. There's a half dozen really strong global firms, Blackstone, KKR, Carlyle, Apollo, Bain Capital, TPG. I think we're all growing and expanding all over the world. Different strengths, different weaknesses, but I think we've all done a nice job. All the firms are 25 to 35 years old. We're 24 years old at this point in time, and it's fun. We get to invest capital and support businesses all over the world, everything from small businesses. We were an early investor in Uber and Airbnb, to very large businesses, all industries, and from the United States to, we have 2 businesses in Myanmar. So we get to see lots of things all over the world, and it's fun.
Well, when your total assets under management are roughly?
About $80 billion. About $80 billion. When we started, we had no assets under management. We actually didn't have any capital. The first transaction that we did was the restructuring of Continental Airlines. It was in its second bankruptcy. It was a terrible company. It was about to be dismantled and sold plane by plane. And this was in 1992, 93. We felt that there was actually something there, that the company, because it was going through its second bankruptcy, was actually able to wash itself from all of its legacy liabilities, and it actually had the lowest cost structure. It would emerge from bankruptcy with the lowest cost structure of any airline in the industry. And we felt we were at the bottom of the economic cycle in 1992, 93, and we brought in a new management team, a gentleman named Gordon Bethune, who then took that airline, and we went from what we call worst to first. When we got there, it was the worst service, the worst flights, the worst baggage claims, and ultimately we merged it with United Airlines, and at that time it was actually considered one of the best run airlines. But we didn't have any capital when we did that. We actually raised the capital with a hat, $55 million of equity, and we restructured a $6 billion airline and obtained about 2/3 of the equity. And that turned out to be a very successful transaction. That was our first transaction. And then after that, we decided to raise an institutional pool of capital. So we raised our first fund in 1994.
In today's world, when you look at the state of the private equity or just industry, the industry in general, where are we at?
Like all industries, the private equity industry is maturing, but the core raison d'etre for the industry is growing rapidly, and that's because our core client are pension funds, sovereign wealth funds in particular. So let's take the state of California or the state of Texas or the state of Pennsylvania or Illinois, their liabilities are growing at 7 or 8% annually because of the way they're set up with their government employees. Well, getting 7 or 8% annually on your investments wasn't so hard when you can invest in bonds at 6% and in equities at 10%. But now that interest rates are so low, it's hard to get much more than 3 or 4% safely on bonds. So in order to blend into 7 or 8%, you're going to need some higher return securities. So the private equity industry over the last 30 years has returned, the average firm has returned about 13 or 14% annually. That's over the last 30 years, over the last 20 years, and over the last 10 years. It's between 12 and 14% over all those time periods. So it's been delivering very strong returns. That's against a stock market that's maybe 7 or 8%. So the need for the pension funds, the sovereign wealth funds, insurance companies, endowments to outperform fixed income securities and regular way public equities is creating real demand for our services. And as a result, the industry is growing. Today, the industry has about $2 trillion of capital sort of under private equity firms' control.
I'm visiting here today with Jonathan Coslet. He is the Chief Investment Officer at Texas Pacific Group, also known as TPG Capital. Jonathan, I need to take a quick break, and we'll be right back after these messages.
I love fishing, with my family.
I think it would be easier to use a net.
It was so much fun.
The times when we are together, it makes it all the more worth it.
Having Dad teach them how to cast a fly rod, and
as long as we're doing stuff together, we're having fun.
Some people see a father and a son fishing together, while others see a succession plan.
Welcome back. I'm here today with Jonathan Coslet. He's the Chief Investment Officer at Texas Pacific Group, also known as TPG Capital. And Jonathan, we talked about the company's state of private equity. You're currently rounding near $80 billion under management. But I want to jump into when you look at an investment, and as the first segment you talked about the market's averaging 7 to 8, private equities 13 to 15%. How do you find the value investment?
Well, at the end of the day, we have to be what I call fringe capital. So private equity as a whole is maybe 5% of the entire equity market capital ecosystem. And the public markets are very efficient. They're getting more and more efficient every day, and therefore the return on that capital is going to be tighter. We have to play around the fringes. We have to see things that others don't see. We have to be willing to do things that others won't do. So around the fringes, we have to do two things. We have to have a different point of view as an investor. We have to have an uncommon point of view as an investor. That means specialization ultimately. So we've set ourselves up as through industry specialization and ultimately geographic specialization. So in the United States, we have a healthcare team, a retail team, a technology team, an energy team, an industrial team. And each of those teams, they got to get deeper and deeper so they can see the slight differences of opinion relative to the common wisdom. That's number one, a different point of view as an investor. Number two, we have to change companies once we own them. We have to improve companies once we own them. We have to do the hard work, like we did at Continental Airlines, like we did at Burger King, like we did at so many companies along the way. That often means changing management. It often means employing new operational and strategic approaches to companies that for whatever reason aren't being managed in a aligned with the shareholders' way. When you have a different point of view as an investor and when you can change companies, you can outperform. It's hard, it takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of capabilities that you develop over time, but that's what we do. And you have to be very selective. You have to say, yeah, this investment, I don't see it that much differently than other folks. This company, I don't see how I can change it much differently than the company is running today. And therefore, it's not something that I can add a lot of value to, as opposed to ones where you do have a different point of view, where you do have a different approach to strategic or operational improvement.
In today's world, you see the influence of the baby boomers and what they've had on markets in the past. And as we're looking at the aging of the baby boomer, is there a specific industry that you favor more when you're looking at private equity and feeling that you can add greater value to companies?
Well, there's two generic approaches as an investor that I would take, whether it be a public market investor or a private market investor. One is what I'd call growth, and the other is what I'd call inflection. So growth would be there's going to be a lot of folks who are 65, 85, and older, and therefore there's going to be huge demands for healthcare services. So that's just a secular growth that's driven demographically, and I need to figure out which part of that sector I want to get in front of because it has the most growth and it has a supply-demand imbalance. It's not enough to say this is growing a lot if supply is also growing as fast or faster. So you want to get in front of things that are growing a lot and yet supply is still lagging behind, where you can have pricing power and you can have margin improvement power. So that would be on the growth side. Then there's what I call inflection investing. So it's not the slope of the curve, it's the second derivative, it's the rate of change. It's the slope is now inflecting up. So being in front of something that's about to change, and that usually means an industry that's being disrupted in transition. Happens to be that something like healthcare has both characteristics. It's growing and it's changing. It's changing because of things like the Affordable Care Act. It's changing because of technology. It's changing because of the internet. It's changing because of science. So when you put something like that growth and that dynamic change together, if you're a real expert, you can find the interesting places because there's a lot of winners. There's also a lot of losers in those segments, and you need to figure out how to separate those out. But we're fairly agnostic about industry per se. Things kind of move in 3 or 4 year cycles. So we're always sort of asking ourselves, what are the themes of the next 3 or 4 years? And at some point, the theme will be, energy prices are really low now, so it's time to get in. And when oil gets to 100, the theme might be energy prices are really high now, and it's time to get out. So we have to play those themes, and those themes are moving dynamically within the developed markets, but also around the world as economies and as countries are changing all around the world.
I'm visiting here today with Jonathan Coslet. He's the Chief Investment Officer at Texas Pacific Group, also known as TPG Capital. Jonathan, I need to take a quick break, and we'll be right back after these messages. Since you can't take your wealth with you, spend time with your family. Welcome back. I'm here today with Jonathan Coslet. He is the Chief Investment Officer at TPG Capital, formerly Texas Pacific Group. And Jonathan, we talked about the industry. We talked about approach to investments. I want to move into business leadership. And in the course of your career and the oversight of all the companies that you've invested in, I'm sure that you've seen certain characteristics, attributes that really have stood out, of people that have the right type of business leadership acumen. And when you look at an individual, what types of attributes do you look for?
Well, true leadership is relatively rare, whether it be in business or in life, but I have had the chance to see scores and scores of CEOs, some of which have been phenomenal leaders and some of which have been not so good leaders. But as I think about it, and I think about the ones that were most compelling to me, they had some of the following characteristics and traits. Number one, They were always driven by a purpose. They weren't driven by money. They weren't driven by ego. They were always driven by a purpose, a raison d'etre, a reason for being. And that purpose always was where they came from, and it's how they communicated what they were doing every day. Number two, they always led by example. Yes, their words may have been powerful, but their actions were more powerful. Number three, they're authentic. They could really relate to people. There are leaders who don't relate well to people, and they may be leaders for a certain period of time, but the ones who can really accomplish a lot can relate to people. They're authentic. Folks know that they're there for the right reason, that they care about them. They're warm. At the same time, they're tough. They're tough when they need to be. They're decisive with imperfect information. And ultimately, they're very results-oriented. They're accountable to their results, and they know, I have a purpose, I have objectives, and I got to be accountable to that purpose and those objectives. And those are rare things to see, but when you get that combination, you can really have powerful leaders. That could be a leader like Gandhi or Martin Luther King, or it could be a business leader like Walt Disney, who started a company because he loved children and he loved cartoons, but he really wanted to change the world around for children. Those are the types of people that are rare, and when you find them, it's an amazing experience to get behind them.
Now I want to move into, as you work with companies, and obviously you're looking for undervalued companies or value investment. When you approach that, though, not everyone is there with welcoming arms saying, come over, take over my company and put in a management team. But how do you approach trying to work with companies where you're trying to come in and create value and also assess the management team? Do they have what it takes, or do we take our people and put them in?
You approach it with respect and you approach it with care, because we assume that everyone is trying to do a great job. And we need to do the diagnosis to figure out which pieces of the puzzle are not fitting just right and how we need to reshape that puzzle. Once we do that diagnosis and we figure out the new strategy, the new approach, then the question is, how do you implement a change plan? At the end of the day, we are agents of change. How do you implement that agent of change approach? Sometimes you have to do it with really, really delicate kit gloves. Sometimes you got to take a sledgehammer and you got to decide in each case what the best approach is, what the right approach is, but you always do it with respect for the people and with a sense of no one knows the future. No one can predict the future. No one knows exactly what's right. We're doing the best we can. We're trusting our instincts. We're trusting our experience. You know, if we're right 2/3 of the time, we're going to be geniuses. So each new endeavor is an experiment, an educated experiment, but you got to approach it in a way that you know that you're going to be making adjustments along the way. But you do use your experience to say, I've seen this type of situation 20 times before. And as I think about it, when I did these things 12 or 13 times, it's worked. When I did these other things, it hasn't worked. So I'm going to use that experience. I'm going to keep pushing it.
Yeah, I love that. Talk about the continually change and reinventing oneself. But a business leader that says, Jonathan, I want to improve. I want to do things the right way. I want to do things differently. What advice would you give them in terms of the best way for them to seek professional development?
That's a really good question. I think a lot of times the young folks in our business, or even my teenage kids, they complain about learning history. And I say to them, you learn history so you can be better at the future. And because history is about human behavior and the future is about human behavior. So if you can see how people acted in the past, they're going to probably act similarly, not exactly the same, but similarly in the future. So the best thing to do is just keep learning, is to keep reading, to keep seeing, to keep experiencing, and to retrospectively do analysis on how things turned out in different situations. Beyond that, I think the best personal development that I've seen for leaders is really understanding themselves, understanding what's important to them, understanding what they want to accomplish, not only at the organization they're at, but in life, understanding what motivates people. And that takes a different type of personal development. It's really an EQ development more than an IQ development.
I want to turn back to individuals leaving college in today's environment. Would you recommend them to pursue careers in private equity, or would you say the market's matured, there's better opportunities?
Well, private equity, I just think of private equity as this small part of the investment world. We, in the developed markets, we're in a capitalist society where capital and business continue to drive the world in positive ways, new products, new services. The capitalistic and business societies that we've been a part of are now helping lift many countries from, out of poverty, places like China, which is a very capitalist society with an authoritative government overlay. So business as a whole, I find to be really interesting because business is life. It doesn't matter whether it's the business of medicine or the business of electronic devices or the business of any service or product. It's how you make that service and product better. Private equity is a capital investment source, again, around the edges, around the fringes, an agent of change. There's always a need for an agent of change. There's always a need for an agent of change that has capital available to them to make that change. So that profession, I think, is really interesting, whether it be in private equity or as an entrepreneur or as a venture capitalist. We could debate around the edges, but that profession of having capital and management to make change, I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, one final question here. When you look at your career, do you have a favorite memory or something that stands out that, some type of success that you realized along the way that really has helped to define who you are?
That changes over time, as you'd suspect. When you're 25 or 30 or 35, it's about the most successful transaction that you did, where the firm made the most money. I think today it's much different for me. We've had hundreds and hundreds, probably 1,000 young folks come through our firm, be trained by us, be mentored by us. They're now off doing lots of other things. We have many CEOs who are analysts in our programs that I see running big companies, and I see them using words that we used when we were training them, the same types of nomenclature and disciplines. So that's really satisfying. And then at the end of the day, I try to think about what our purpose is as a firm, and we really believe we have sort of two core pillars. Pillar number one is superb returns, because ultimately our customer, that pension fund, that sovereign wealth fund, that endowment, we want to be one of the few firms in the world that can deliver in size superb returns, because that's a hard thing to do, to be top decile, to be top quartile, and to deliver that onto their beneficiaries, onto the teachers and the policemen and the firemen and the social security system of places like China and Singapore. That's number one. And number two is to create a special organization with special people that helps those people grow as individuals, not only in their career, but in their lives. So superb returns, special organization. And if we can do that when we're all done, and then hand the firm on to the next generations, which we're already doing, and have the firm be around 50 or 100 years from now, that would feel like it was an okay thing to do.
I've been visiting here today with Jonathan Coslet. He is the Chief Investment Officer at Texas Pacific Group, also known as TPG Capital. Jonathan, appreciate you being on today's show.
That was a pleasure. Thank you so much.